In a move that sent shockwaves through Washington and Wall Street, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood firm and said no. 2 letters, a single syllable, yet powerful enough to rattle the very foundations of Western confidence. It wasn't just a rejection of tariffs. It was a rejection of intimidation, a rejection of the idea that smaller nations must always bow to the will of the powerful. The setting was tense. Trump's negotiators came armed with numbers, ultimatums, and threats of economic isolation. They expected compliance, a quick signature, and a quiet surrender. Instead, Traoré leaned forward, his voice steady, his gaze unflinching. His words landed like a grenade in the room. Burkina Faso will not be bullied. Silence followed. For a moment, even the translators hesitated, unsure if they had heard correctly. Across the ocean, markets bristled, commentators scrambled, and the news ticker lit up like a siren. The unthinkable had happened. A young African leader had stared down America's most hardline demands and refused to flinch. But this was only the beginning, because what happened next would ripple far beyond Burkina Faso, leaving the West scrambling, and Trump furious. Trump's America First agenda had always been blunt, unapologetic, and wrapped in the language of dominance. To his supporters, tariffs were weapons, proof that America could bend others to its will. To his critics, they were blunt instruments of coercion, a way to strong-arm nations into submission under the guise of fair trade. For decades, smaller states, especially in Africa, had been conditioned to accept these terms, fearing economic isolation if they resisted. Compliance wasn't just expected, it was assumed. But this time something different was unfolding. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, barely in his 30s, did what generations of leaders before him had been pressured not to do. He pushed back. His iron stance wasn't just about a trade agreement. It was about the story of a continent tired of being told its worth, tired of being dictated to, tired of being forced to choose between dignity and survival. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. A young African leader standing against the most powerful economy in the world was more than a headline. It was a declaration that sovereignty could not be measured in tariffs, and identity could not be negotiated at a bargaining table. To millions watching, Traoré's refusal was validation, proof that dignity could triumph over intimidation. In Washington, frustration simmered. In Ouagadougou, pride swelled. Analysts tried to frame it as a minor trade spat, but the truth was obvious. Something seismic had shifted. The West had grown comfortable with compliance. Now that comfort was cracking, and as Traoré's defiance echoed across the globe, it became clear this was more than a trade dispute. It was the opening shot of a global reckoning. Donald J. Trump built his political identity on a promise. America would never again be taken advantage of. To his base, he was the deal-maker-in-chief, the man who would rewrite the rules of global trade with the same bravado he once flaunted in Manhattan boardrooms. To the world, he was something else entirely. A bulldozer wrapped in a suit carrying tariffs like a sledgehammer. From his first days in office, Trump wielded tariffs not as policy tools, but as weapons. He slapped duties on steel and aluminum, threatening allies like Canada and the European Union as though they were adversaries. He launched a bruising trade war with China, insisting that tariffs would bring jobs back home, even as American farmers felt the sting of retaliation. Every confrontation followed the same script: intimidate, demand, escalate, and then declare victory, whether or not one had been achieved. It was diplomacy by shock and awe. For Trump, the spectacle mattered more than the fine print. He thrived on confrontation, knowing that headlines of him standing tough fed the image of an uncompromising nationalist. And often his approach worked, not because the world admired his tactics, but because many leaders preferred the cost of compliance over the chaos of resistance. But beneath the bluster, contradictions piled up. Trump spoke endlessly about freedom, sovereignty, and self-reliance, yet his methods cornered smaller nations into dependence and submission. He railed against global elites, while weaponizing America's economic might to force others into line. He promised fairness but practiced coercion. The more he preached strength, the clearer it became that his power rested not on partnership but on fear. In the halls of power, his advisors understood the formula: threaten tariffs high enough to scare markets, offer a slim pathway to retreat, and then trumpet even the smallest concession as a monumental win. It was a one-size-fits-all playbook, and for years it delivered headlines and applause at rallies. Yet hubris grew in the repetition. Trump had faced off against Beijing, Brussels, and Ottawa. He believed he had mastered the art of forcing others into his shadow. To him, an African nation like Burkina Faso was not even a worthy opponent, but a minor player on a vast chessboard. In his mind, the outcome was predetermined. Traoré would cave, just like so many before him, but Trump was about to face something he never expected, a leader who simply wouldn't bend. Ibrahim Traoré did not rise from privilege or dynasty. He rose from dust, from the raw heat of Burkina Faso's streets, where the weight of colonial legacies and modern exploitation pressed down on every citizen. Born in 1988, he was barely 34 when he seized the reins of a nation, making him one of the youngest leaders in the world. His story was not that of a politician groomed for power, but of a soldier molded in struggle, a revolutionary tempered by fire. From his earliest days, Traoré carried himself with an intensity that made others stop and listen. Fellow soldiers recall his clarity under pressure, the way he could calm chaos with a few firm words. He wasn't just respected, he was trusted. In a land scarred by repeated coups and political betrayals, that trust became currency more valuable than gold. His charisma didn't come from rehearsed speeches, but from the authenticity of a man who lived as his people lived, who knew their hunger, their hopes, their heartbreak. When Burkina Faso convulsed with unrest, it was Traoré who stepped forward, young but resolute, to take the mantle of leadership in 2022. Many dismissed him at first as too inexperienced, too radical, too idealistic to last. Yet almost immediately, he revealed the steel beneath the surface. He survived plots to remove him, stood firm against assassination attempts, and pushed back against foreign meddling that sought to keep Burkina Faso in perpetual dependency. Every time the pressure mounted, Traoré seemed to grow stronger, his resolve hardening like tempered steel. To his supporters, he became more than a president. He became a symbol of defiance against exploitation, of sovereignty reclaimed, of a new Africa unafraid to speak in its own voice. In markets and villages, his image was carried on banners, his words repeated like mantras. Burkina Faso would not kneel. He embodied dignity in the face of arrogance, sovereignty against exploitation, self-determination against coercion. The West watched him with wary eyes. Here was a leader too young to be predictable, too unbending to be controlled. Analysts whispered about his anti-Western streak, while ordinary citizens across the continent celebrated him as a brother who dared to defy the script written for Africa. For many, Traoré was living proof that youth, when fused with courage, could shake empires. But behind the speeches and the symbols was a man who had carried real risk on his shoulders. He had stared down generals who plotted in secret, foreign envoys who offered deals laced with chains, and mercenaries who believed bullets could solve what politics could not. He had emerged each time not as a victim but as a survivor, and more importantly, as a leader who refused to trade dignity for survival. It was this journey, soldier, revolutionary survivor symbol, that prepared him for the confrontation ahead. Because when Donald Trump's tariff demands slammed onto the table, lined with threats and coated with arrogance, Traoré was not intimidated. He had faced bullets. He had faced betrayal. He had faced the crushing weight of history itself. And so when Trump's demands hit the table, Traoré was ready with the words that would shake the room. The negotiation room was thick with tension, the kind of silence that hums just before a storm. Trump's envoys had come armed with binders of statistics, projections, and ultimatums. Charts flashed on screens painting grim futures if Burkina Faso refused to comply. Sanctions, trade exclusion, the specter of isolation. Each threat landed like a stone hurled across the table. Their language was sharp, the tone condescending. Without American markets, your exports collapse. Without our investment, your growth halts. Without our partnership, you'll be left behind. Every line dripped with the assumption that Burkina Faso had no choice, that submission was inevitable. It was less a negotiation than an ambush dressed in the trappings of diplomacy. But Traoré didn't flinch. Seated upright, his uniform sharp, his gaze steady, he absorbed every word as though the threats were passing winds. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, each syllable measured. Burkina Faso's dignity is not for sale, he said. The room shifted. A flicker of discomfort rippled across the faces opposite him. Trump's team pressed harder, raising the stakes. They warned of blocked aid, restricted loans, even diplomatic isolation. Their strategy was pressure by suffocation, close every door until only one remained, the door of submission. But Traoré refused to move. "You mistake silence for weakness," he countered. "Our people have survived storms before. We will survive yours." The clash became more than policy. It became theater. Every time the Americans leaned forward, raising their voices, Traoré leaned back unbothered, his restraint more powerful than their aggression. Each pause, each measured response carried the weight of defiance. The negotiators came expecting compliance. What they encountered was immovable resolve. As the hours dragged on, frustration began to seep into the American side. Their threats grew sharper, their tone more desperate. Yet the more they escalated, the more composed Traoré became. It was as if the young leader had tapped into something deeper, not just political will, but the unyielding spirit of his nation. The standoff reached a boiling point. Every word from Trump's team grew heavier, edged with frustration, their voices straining to break him. And yet Traoré remained unmoved, his replies simple but devastating in their finality. Each word was heavier than the last, and the tension reached a breaking point. The breaking point came with a silence so thick it seemed the air itself was waiting. Trump's envoys had exhausted their arsenal of threats. Charts no longer mattered. Ultimatums had lost their sting. The room was a battlefield, and every eye turned toward Ibrahim Traoré. He leaned forward slightly, the faint scrape of his chair echoing louder than any speech that had come before. Then he spoke. "Burkina Faso will not pay for America's fear," he said, his voice even but unyielding. "We will not surrender our sovereignty to tariffs, nor will we accept humiliation disguised as partnership. Our nation may be small, but our dignity is greater than your threats." The words hung in the air like thunder rolling across an open plain. For a moment, no one moved. One of Trump's aides glanced nervously at the others, as though unsure if they had misheard. Another shuffled papers, buying time, as if paper could shield them from the gravity of what had just been said. Traoré paused deliberately, allowing the silence to speak for him. His eyes swept across the room, not confrontational but commanding, as if daring anyone to meet his gaze and still insist on submission. When he continued, his words cut sharper than any sanction could. "You tell us we will collapse without your markets," he said slowly. "But what collapses a nation is not lack of trade. It is lack of dignity. We would rather struggle with honor than prosper in chains." A murmur ran through the room. Even the translators hesitated, repeating his words with a reverence that betrayed the power they carried. One could almost imagine an unseen audience rising to its feet, a roar of applause shaking through the walls. Trump, who had built his career on never showing weakness, shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened, his arms crossed, the familiar mask of confidence faltering. For a man who thrived on dominance, on forcing others to yield, the sight of a young leader standing tall without fear was disarming. Cameras captured every flicker of discomfort, every twitch that betrayed frustration. And then came the finishing blow. Traoré leaned back, his voice calm but ringing with finality. "If partnership with America requires us to abandon our sovereignty, then it is not partnership. It is extortion. And Burkina Faso will never submit to extortion." The words landed like a hammer. Even the walls seemed to vibrate with their force. What began as a negotiation had become a declaration, a rallying cry for more than just one nation. Outside that room, the shock waves were immediate. Within minutes, clips of Traoré's remarks began circulating online. Hashtags like #Africa Rises and Stand with Traoré trended across platforms. Memes portrayed him as a giant towering over a rattled Trump, while commentators hailed the speech as a line in the sand for African sovereignty. Ordinary citizens across the continent shared videos of his calm defiance, calling him a hero, a symbol of pride and resistance. African leaders, too, began to take notice. Statements of support flowed in, cautious at first, then louder, as if Traoré's courage had given them permission to voice their own frustrations with Western pressure. In capitals from Dakar to Addis Ababa, his words were replayed in parliamentary halls, on radio stations, in marketplaces. Meanwhile, Trump found himself cornered in an unfamiliar way. His usual script, Bluster, intimidation, then triumph, had been torn apart before the world's eyes. The confidence that once seemed unshakable now looked brittle. His trademark swagger reduced to clenched teeth and terse silence. For perhaps the first time in his political theater, the villain's dominance had been met with a hero's unshakable truth. And the villain blinked, but what erupted next went far beyond one press room. It ignited a storm. The moment Traoré's words echoed beyond the negotiation chamber, the world seemed to shift. It began with whispers, startled reporters rushing to file stories, financial analysts typing furiously as stock tickers twitched, and diplomats scrambling to understand what had just happened. Within hours, those whispers swelled into a roar. Traoré had not merely rejected tariffs. He had rewritten the rules of engagement between the West and Africa. Across the African continent, the response was electric. In Dakar, crowds gathered in cafes and markets replaying the video of Traoré's defiant declaration on their phones. In Lagos, university students broke into cheers as they shared clips on social media, hailing him as the face of a new African century. In Addis Ababa, lawmakers debated his words with a mix of admiration and apprehension. Admiration for the courage, apprehension for the risks. Yet the prevailing mood was unmistakable. Here was a leader who had dared to do what others only whispered about. The hashtags came next, and they came like wildfire. Stand with Traoré. Africa rises. By our dignity over tariffs. On Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, his face appeared over and over again, framed with captions like, "For once, the West blinked first." Memes mocked Trump as a rattled giant, contrasted against a calm, unflinching Traoré. Cartoonists across Africa depicted him as a lion standing firm against a storm, while Trump was shown as a faltering bully stripped of his swagger. For many ordinary Africans, this was more than political theater. It was personal validation. For decades, their nations had been treated as bargaining chips, their resources extracted, their leaders pressured into silence. Traoré's refusal was proof that their dignity was not expendable. In villages and cities alike, people said the same phrase in countless languages. At last, someone said no. The ripple spread beyond Africa. In Europe, leaders gathered in hushed circles, whispering about what Traoré's defiance might unleash. France, with its colonial history in West Africa, found itself particularly unsettled. Could this spark a wave of resistance across the region? Germany and the EU debated the economic implications. What would happen if other African nations followed Burkina Faso's example and began refusing Western terms? For the first time in years, Africa was not the subject of pity or patronage but of strategic anxiety. Markets reacted with the same volatility as politics. Commodities tied to African exports wobbled as traders feared instability. Yet in African markets themselves there was a strange calm, a belief that instability was already their reality, and that Traoré's defiance might finally point toward something better. Commentators flooded television screens. Some hailed Traoré as the embodiment of a new global balance, a David standing firm against Goliath. Others warned of consequences, sanctions, aid cuts, the dangers of isolation. Yet even the skeptics admitted the symbolism was undeniable. A leader from one of the poorest nations on earth had looked the richest nation in the eye and refused to bow. Influencers, too, amplified the moment. African diaspora voices in London, Paris, and New York recorded emotional videos, tears in their eyes as they spoke of feeling seen for the first time. "This isn't just about Burkina Faso," one young woman declared on TikTok. "It's about all of us who have roots in Africa, who have watched our people silenced. Today we saw dignity win." Even in the United States, reactions were split. Trump loyalists fumed on cable news, calling Traoré reckless, painting him as an ungrateful adversary. But others, academics, progressives, immigrant communities, quietly celebrated his courage. For them it was refreshing, even inspiring, to see the script of American dominance disrupted. And then there was the emotional resonance, the feeling that history had shifted in a way too profound to ignore. Ordinary voices online captured it best. One viral post read simply, "This is the moment we stop asking permission." Another, liked hundreds of thousands of times, proclaimed, "For once, the West blinked first." By nightfall, it was clear the confrontation was no longer a bilateral dispute. It had become a global story, a spark in the tinderbox of power relations between North and South, rich and poor, colonizer and colonized, and yet, as the world leaned in holding its breath, one question loomed like a thundercloud. If this was only the beginning, what storm was about to break? In the aftermath of the storm, Traoré's voice cut through the chaos, calm and measured. "This isn't about tariffs," he declared, speaking not just to diplomats or reporters, but to the hearts of millions watching across continents. "This is about respect, about the dignity of a people who will not be treated as pawns, about the sovereignty of a nation that refuses to be intimidated." His words reframed the moment. What had begun as a trade confrontation was no longer about numbers, percentages, or economic leverage. It had become a lesson in the power of self-respect, a reminder that coercion can never replace consent, and that intimidation crumbles when met with unwavering principle. Traoré had not simply blocked tariffs, he had affirmed a universal truth. Dignity outweighs threat, sovereignty triumphs over domination. For Africa and for the world, the symbolism was profound. His defiance echoed the struggles of the continent's ancestors, who resisted colonial rule, fought for independence, and demanded recognition in a world that often sought to minimize them. Traoré's stance was a living continuation of that legacy, a modern testament to courage, leadership, and the unyielding value of standing tall against forces that underestimate you. The crescendo of this moment was both intimate and global. Ordinary citizens felt their pride reflected in a single leader's calm resolve. Analysts and commentators could no longer reduce the story to economics alone. Every reaction, every echo of support, carried with it the weight of history and the promise of a new chapter. The audience watching online, on television, and in marketplaces understood that they were witnessing more than a political maneuver. They were witnessing a shift in global consciousness. And in that shift, a quiet inspiration took root. It was a reminder that courage is contagious, that a single act of principle can ripple across nations, and that even the smallest voices, when rooted in conviction, can reshape the narrative of power itself. Traoré's victory was not just for Burkina Faso. It was a moment for anyone who has ever been told to yield, for anyone who has ever been underestimated. In standing firm, he had illuminated a path where dignity is never negotiable, and respect is never optional. History, it seemed, was watching, and so were we. Traoré blocked Trump's tariff demands, and in doing so, he opened a question the West still fears to answer. Has their nightmare just begun? This moment was never merely about trade or politics. It was about principle, about the unshakable power of dignity when confronted with arrogance. It reminded the world that no nation, no matter its size, should be coerced into submission, and that sovereignty is a right, not a privilege to be negotiated. Across continents, ordinary citizens felt the surge of validation, pride in watching a young leader stand firm, refusing to trade integrity for expedience. Analysts and commentators called it historic, but for those who understand what it truly means to defend identity and autonomy, it was deeply personal. Traoré's courage reaffirmed a simple truth. Threats may intimidate, but they cannot conquer the human spirit. If you believe dignity is louder than intimidation, share this story. Subscribe and stand with us, because history is being written right now. Every view, every share, every voice adds to the chorus affirming that sovereignty and respect are not optional. This isn't just a lesson for Burkina Faso or for Africa or for the West. It's a call for all of us to witness, participate, and ensure that courage and principle always prevail.